Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. I don't have a book to hold up today because today I want to talk about a book that I listened to on audiobook on LibriVox. You can get it for free online, called The New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon. So this is a very short work. It's actually the last work that Bacon would have written in his life. But it's a really fascinating little window into his world, and in a sense, is kind of a good capstone for what he was working on throughout his life. So, first, just a word about Francis Bacon's biography. He was an English politician, scientist, and philosopher. I think his dates are like 1561 to 1626. He lived during the Elizabethan era, served under King James I in the royal court there, and had various positions throughout his life in government and in society. He was very significant in part because his ideas and philosophy are part of what led to the scientific revolution of the early modern period and really set the stage for modernism as we experienced it going on into the 18th and 19th and 20th century. So Francis Bacon is a very significant figure in philosophy of science and learning and reasoning and all of that. So he's sort of an early Enlightenment figure in that sense. So he's written widely on a range of things. He was an advocate very much for empirical, inductive reasoning and developed ideas that would kind of become the scientific method as we know it today. So obviously science has been happening for as long as humanity has existed. One of the myths of modern historiography is that you don't really get science until the 1700s with Enlightenment thinkers. That's not the case. Science is happening before then, but there's definitely a shift that happens where there's not just different thinkers, different places doing their own things, but sort of a standard by which scientists, throughout society and then eventually around the world are going to be basing their studies upon, and that kind of systematic approach to the study of science is something that does develop later, and Francis Bacon is an important figure in that development, in that story. So, what is this book about, The New Atlantis? Well, it's a very short work. It's actually an unfinished work. He was writing it right up until the time of his death. He died in 1626. This book was published in 1627. It's a very short little work, but it is basically Francis Bacon's description of what he thinks a perfect society would look like. So in terms of genre, this would be part of kind of utopian literature. What would an ideal society be? And he paints this picture in a very engaging way. He basically tells it as a story of a ship that gets blown off course in a storm. They're off the coast of South America and they get blown out to a storm. They're in the middle of the Pacific and they stumble upon this island that's inhabited by this utopian society. And so the story is, they get kind of shipwrecked there and they are welcomed by this society and they gradually get to learn about this people and how they function and all of that. And so Bacon uses that encounter to portray what he thinks an ideal society would be. There's a couple of interesting things about this society that Francis Bacon paints. The first is that Bacon spends a lot of time stressing that this is a Christian society. And even though this is a society, an island that is unknown to the rest of the world, it's been kind of cut off from the rest of the world, he still stresses they are Christians. And the way that they become Christians is interesting. Basically, in Bacon's imagining of this, that one of the apostles, I think the apostle Bartholomew, was told by an angel to put a copy of the scriptures into a little ark, basically this little box, and push it out to sea. And then, in the providence of God, this box gets washed up on the shore of this island. They read it, they become Christians. So they hold to the same Bible that Western Christians would have. They hold to the same religion that Western Christians would have, even though it developed completely separately. So that's an interesting thing. But that's not an accident, because what Bacon is wanting to say is that the foundation of an ideal society is religion, and specifically Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. Now, this is the part already where people will be surprised maybe by what Bacon sees an ideal society as being. And if you just go and look at the reviews of this book, you'll find this. People are going and they're going, okay, here's this guy who is the father of empiricism, as some would say. He's developing the scientific method. He's leading to the scientific revolution. Surely he's going to either be against religion, or maybe religion's important in his day, so he'll make some little mention of it, but it's not a big deal. It's the main thing he talks about. And he actually goes out of his way to stress it's the most important thing. Because even though this is a society, as we'll talk about in a moment, that has great advancements in learning and in technology and science and all of these things, the sailors first ask, how did you become Christians? And it says that the people of this utopian society were thrilled that they would ask that question and that they would start there, because that showed their priorities were in the right place. So Bacon is saying religion, and Christian religion specifically, is what's most important. If you want to ask a utopian society, you start there, which is very different than I think how a lot of people think today and how people would imagine a leader of the scientific revolution would think. They would say, oh, surely he's going to start with the technologies and the studies, and religion will either be absent or in the background, but he puts it in the foreground. So that's interesting. The second thing he does, after kind of describing the religious culture of the society, is to talk about how that society views families. And it talks about this feast where, basically stable, healthy families are recognized and honored by the state. And he has this whole kind of ritual that he describes where, like the patriarch of a family, multiple generations will be honored by society and put his blessing and honor on his family, and how this is so important. And so, again, another turn that we wouldn't expect from a modern perspective. We tend to downplay organized religion. We tend to downplay the institution of the family. Bacon doesn't do that. In some ways, he represents the classical emphasis on pietas, or piety, which would be a respect for God, respect for religion, and a respect for the family, and seeing those as being hand in hand. So Bacon's utopian vision can feel fairly conservative to us. Now, that's not to say that he fits neatly into one category or the other, but it's just interesting to see how the way that he portrays society is maybe counterintuitive. And that may be something that, if you are not a Christian, not in a more conservative standpoint, you're very big in progress, though, to maybe consider that some of the things that you may assume go together don't necessarily go together. And some of the things that you may assume don't have anything to do with each other, religion and science, in Bacon's world very much do. So reading him on his own terms, taking him as he's presenting himself, these are things that not only can go together, in his view, they have to go together. So you at least have to consider, okay, here's the father of the scientific method, and he's saying, for science to advance, for learning to advance, you need to have Orthodox Christian religion. And it needs to take place in a society where family is valued, fathers are valued. Those are messages we don't hear today. So it's interesting to see him presenting it that way. But the most famous part of the book is the last part of the book, which is where Bacon goes on to describe the advances and discoveries of this island society. And he covers a lot of ground here. I won't go through everything. But what's interesting is that Francis Bacon ends up kind of, in imagining what this society has accomplished, he ends up kind of predicting a number of inventions that we see today. Things like electronic music, and things like, protein shakes and submarines and airplanes, and all of these kinds of technologies and inventions and discoveries which we have today, Bacon was imagining back in the 1600s. So, very interesting always to kind of see those anticipations of the future. But what Bacon sees is at the center of this society is this kind of like a university. It's kind of a research university where these men who are kind of pious men, right? They're almost like high priests of the society, are also the men of learning. And that's something that we see, again, is very much an ideal for Bacon that we tend to separate. If we do give a place to religion, it's in a totally different category than learning and science. For Bacon, it's one and the same. The leaders of one are the leaders of the other. These two things go together. Again, you can disagree with that, but that's how the father of the scientific method is viewing society in an ideal way. And so he talks about all the discoveries that they make and the scientific examinations they're doing of the weather, of food, botany, of music, of architecture, just in every area of life. And it's a fascinating window into the mind of a great man, and a man who, again, lays the foundation and sets the trajectory for much of the modern world and much of the Enlightenment. He's not the only figure, but he's a very important figure. And his little book, The New Atlantis, gives us a wonderful entry into his thinking and a kind of view through his eyes. Again, as a mature thinker, this is the last thing he's writing. It's actually left unfinished. One of his friends kind of writes a quick ending and gets it published. But it would have been interesting to see how he would have fleshed out and finished the work had he had time to do so. But as it stands, it's actually very well written. It's not hard to read. Because of the story format, it makes it pretty engaging. And there's lots of things that are of interest if you are interested in science, interested in philosophy, interested in religion. You'll find this to be a very worthwhile book. So even though I don't have a copy to hold up for you, I would highly recommend The New Atlantis by Francis Bacon.